This is the Education Business Podcast for consultants and business owners providing services in schools. I'm Claire Riley, and I'll be sharing how to start, grow and scale your education business. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Education Business Podcast. Today I am introducing a new feature that we're going to have on the Education Business Podcast, and that is all on legals. So as we grow our businesses up and we bring more value into our businesses, we have to have a greater understanding of everything legal, all sorts of risks, different contracts that we need to have in place, things that change in the law that could affect our businesses. And I know it's one of the areas where people really want advice. They want to know that they're able to listen to the right people. And so I'm bringing the right people. So each quarter, I'm going to be talking with Frank on the Education Business Podcast. And so I'll let Frank introduce himself as we have a chat about what you need to be aware of legally in your business at the moment. Frank, welcome to the Education Business Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been trying to set this up for a while, and I'm so pleased that you are here because this is not the first episode that you're going to do. And it's the area that, as people who have been a teacher before and now we're going to business, that we're probably most scared of, which is, what do I do from a legal perspective? I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times I've been asked for a contract that I've paid somebody for, or how do I make sure that my legals are correct in this contract or in this notice? And it's not just about that small thing either. It's about a wider piece. And so you're here really to educate us on all of that. But first, I say nobody, some people might not know who you are. So tell us what you do and why it's important that we're listening to you right now.
Thank you, Claire. Well, I'm a director within the law firm Freeths. We're a national legal practice with 13 offices. I provide commercial law services to businesses, and my main focus is, to be honest, education. And that's perhaps no surprise because in my earlier life, I first of all qualified as an accountant, didn't want to be an accountant. I became quite scared about what that career involved. Spent a year kicking my heels really by going to teacher training college and then joining a college of technology as a lecturer in accountancy and business law, because my degree included business law. And I became more interested in the business law, as you might understand from what I said a minute or two ago. Took my law degree. It was under English law, so that's why I'm down here in England, in Yorkshire. And if everything comes full circle, I'm back into education because the client base within education really interested me. An awful lot of lawyers have become involved in education and become education experts, but that's because schools have become academies. And there's a lot of lawyers now advising in the multi-academy trust arena, for example. I chose not to do that. I chose to be on the side of the suppliers because I realized when academization started, gosh, that's going to have to be understood by businesses. And so I thought they needed an advisor that could help them understand when a school moves from being a maintained school, what that means to becoming a multi-academy trust and so on. And so that's my story, really.
I just want to say thank you for doing that for us. Thank you for being that person.
It was so obvious to me that the sector does need advice. And I think law firms are becoming much more clear about being sectoral focused. You can walk through the door of any law firm and ask them to advise you on something like a contract, as you said. But does that person understand who the customer is? Because it's really important to understand the customer in terms of setting the terms of the contract. And there's areas that you need specialist advice, intellectual property, for example. And probably the best example, when I went down this path, I realized, gosh, personal data is going to become a big thing. I was aware that a lot of businesses in the sector are ed tech, and they're sharing the personal data of the students and the pupils. And so I actually made absolutely sure that I got up to date on GDPR as it was being introduced. And the way I convinced myself that I was up to date on that was actually by writing a book on the subject, so that I really felt I was comprehensively able to deal with the issue. These are the sort of things that become important.
Yeah. So at Freeths, you do things, I think, a little bit differently from a lot of law firms. So when we think about the legal aspects of needing things in a business, we think, oh my word, I'm a startup and I need to know these really expensive things, but I don't even know if I'll get the information that I need and what's it going to cost me. But you look at the education piece of it differently. Not the education, but the education of the education, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was very taken by the last podcast you did, Claire, on the subject of, you called it saboteurs. And it was the things that you can, I think, personally end up sabotaging your own business model. And the very first item you talked about was the subject of knowledge. And your businesses will look at other businesses that have been successful in the area that they're working in and say, gosh, I want to be up there with them. How do I do that? And they know that getting that business to share their knowledge and experiences isn't going to be easy, if possible at all. So people try to become, we sometimes in the practice call it have a go hero type situations, where people push themselves to the limit in terms of, I can do this. And they're working in an area that they haven't really had experience in. And so when you say we do things differently, one of the things that we have been clear about is that we will share knowledge. We'll share knowledge very openly. And importantly, we share it in the context of education. So you can go onto any law firm's website now, and we're all desperate actually to show how clever we are. And so go to any law firm's website and you'll see lots of knowledge here, this latest legal development and so on. But what we're doing differently is by putting things in an education context. And we have dedicated web pages actually for education businesses. So you don't have to wander around our website trying to find it. You can go straight to it.
That's amazing. Thank you. And on that, really, that's why you're going to be coming to speak on the Education Business Podcast, probably quarterly, really, to tell us what it is we need to know. Because as education businesses, we're focused on running the business, and sometimes we don't realize what's going on legally in the background, and those are risky things that are happening, really, that we're not really got our eye on. So thankfully, we can rely on you for that. So what do we need to know about right now as people in the education business sector?
Yeah. Well, the good thing is you're not just relying on me. That might be quite dangerous. We've got a team of people that work with education businesses covering intellectual property, employment, corporate, and so on. So there's a team of people actually bring what we call commercial education brief together. And the current version is on our website, and there's an option to subscribe to it. As you say, it comes out every 3 months. And the last issue is covering, I think, some really challenging subjects. We couldn't, as a law firm, obviously ignore AI. AI is now quite literally everywhere. And your schools and those that work with schools are really having to grapple with a very difficult issue. They want to, particularly the businesses, want to show that they are AI cognizant. Lots of people are trying to and are actually building AI into their products. It's becoming a really interesting and I would say tricky issue. So my colleagues, Will Richmond-Coggan and Mona Shodel, have written an article on how AI is impacting on schools and looking at some of the risk issues. And it's very interesting, the things that they have thought about. A lot of emphasis now on personalized learning, and that is seen as a good thing. I'm sure it is a good thing. But then you've got to reconcile that with formal exams, where you kind of end up going back down a funnel into an exam that everybody else is sitting in the same way. And that's the sort of issue that I think is with us just now, and quite how long it'll be with us, I'm not sure. But it does pose the question when we talk about education as a personal experience, that's always got to be with a mission in mind, if you like. So that's a good read, I would say.
What do we need to watch out for then? So I think some businesses have gone, headlong straight into AI, and some businesses are scared about maybe opening that up. Are there any specific things that you think we need to be aware of to do or not do around the subject of AI, or is it so new that it's hard to really say? But it's there's not really anything to look back on, is there? I think sometimes, well, a lot of the time, law is about cases, isn't it, that you have to look back on. So, what kind of things are we predicting might be an issue?
Yeah. I think one of the key things is large language models that you can buy into. As a business, you can buy into data provided by others. You can buy algorithms prepared by others. You don't have to create an AI model all on your own. There's lots of support out there in various forms. For a long time, there has been concern in areas which touch on personal data. Is the data going to be biased? Could somebody lose out on an opportunity or be misled because the model is biased? There's a lot of concern around data scraping, as it's called, where the data that is put together into the model isn't actually legitimate in terms of you're coming from a reliable source. And there's other aspects. There's the safety aspects as well of AI. We've now got the Online Safety Act, and that act does provide a break, if you like, on some of the practices that have happened in the past. And maybe it's less described as a break, but more positive obligation on the big platforms to manage the way algorithms are used on their platforms.
Yeah. Say if you are an education business owner and you're considering using AI, or you are using AI, what are the things we can get into trouble for if we don't do it properly?
There are privacy groups that will challenge. When I joined Freeths, my very first instruction was a challenge by a privacy group on an education business. And this is quite amusing in the sense that they had been promoting their subject as AI powered. And then when this challenge came in, they were actually backtracking on that. This was in the very early days. So AI was seen as something very different and something fantastic to bring into the activities within the classroom. But they then backtracked on it. It's not actually really AI. Some of it was automated, if you like. But at the end of the day, teachers were still in control, and nothing happened involving the children without the teacher's sanction, if you like. So it's quite funny the way that AI has been used as a marketing tool, but suddenly now people are realizing, oh, actually, I shouldn't do that unless I really am serious about it. And the things to watch for, undoubtedly, are that you've got the right privacy notice. Doing impact assessments is still a lot misunderstood in terms of what data protection laws require. If your AI model is dealing with personal data, you do have to be very careful about documenting the impact that the processing done through AI has affecting the individual. And so a data privacy impact assessment is always something that should be done. And there's lots of really good information on the Information Commissioner's website. That's one thing I would call out. You don't have to necessarily go to a lawyer as the first port of call. There's some fantastic resources, including templates for assessment documents on the Information Commissioner's website.
I love that. Thank you so much. And what I would say is, yeah, absolutely go look at that. But this is where, when you find somebody great, you just want to ask them all the questions and say, please help me and do it for me. That's good for you as well. Well, the team anyway. So that's AI then. I've got a list of different things here. What about the way that we market products? Do we have to look at anything to do with that?
Yes. A lot of people don't realize that marketing is now quite a regulated subject. I'm sure we're all familiar in our personal lives with when things go wrong, there's usually some legislation there that hopefully will help you put it right. If a flight's cancelled, the airline has got to do certain things. And that's because of regulation. And regulation does affect the marketing activities of businesses, particularly those working in the digital era, but not exclusively. If what you're doing isn't digital, then you're still affected by this. And it's very much the case when you're dealing with consumers. And consumers are students themselves, if they're purchasing, parents and carers who are concerned about their children's education, wanting to buy into something.
But
Yeah.
you've clarified there, obviously, that we're talking about parents or students.
Uh-huh.
Would you include teachers in that or not, even if they're purchasing it for themselves?
That's a really interesting question, Claire, and it's an unanswered question at the moment, unfortunately. You could argue both ways. That person is purchasing from their own taxed income, and it's a great shame you have to do that, but people care so much about how they deliver their education. It's actually quite likely that it will be seen as a business purchase because of the way it's being used. In other words, if you show I bought that because my son Johnny really needed help with developing his phonics skills, that's fine, that's consumer. If you then say I bought that because I'm using it as a work in my class, even although you paid for it, it's more likely to fall on the side of business, which is a pity perhaps, but a distinction has to be made one way or another.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. I just think that is one area where we all get confused because we're not really sure. Can I class this as business? Can I class this as consumer? It's very difficult. Anyway, sorry, I
Yeah.
interrupted you.
No, that's okay. So we've actually, it was quite interesting having a general election called so suddenly. There was a bill going through Parliament at the time with an incredibly long title. Let's go for it. Digital Market Consumers and Competition Act. I might have got consumer and competition the wrong way around there, but that's the way it is. And that bill just squeezed through at the end of the parliamentary session. And that was the government's attempt to really push through a lot of improvements, if you like, in consumer rights and other rights as well, because this is very relevant in the business context as well, to make our enforcement system, our regulatory system, when we have to enforce against unfair practices, up to date and fit for the digital age. Now, the things that are covered by that are one we've just covered in our most recent issue of Commercial Education Brief. A lot of education products can now take advantage of platforms that will not necessarily actively sell their products, but will promote them. And of course, a really important issue that people have to understand and want to understand is how they can best validate their product as delivering educational outcomes that are really good. You have to convince teachers and those involved in procurement that what you're selling is really, really good and you have got good outcomes from it. So what better than to actually have teachers who've used the product in the classroom actually writing reviews for you? But if that person is writing with any kind of bias, that's not a good thing. And we've all probably seen in the news stories about about products being rubbished by competitors who write reviews that are not right. And that's clearly where the words fake review would come into play. And so there's going to be a lot more control around the way platforms might engage with reviewers, making sure that reviews are totally independent. And there are going to be penalties for businesses that don't follow the rules around that. Even the platform operators have got to now exercise due diligence, actually posting reviews to make sure that they've carried out your checks on the business that they're supporting through posting their reviews. That legislation's not in effect yet, and it may take some time. There's been a consultation around the detail of it. Another area within that act is subscriptions. And obviously, for a lot of education businesses, subscriptions are really important to them. It's a really attractive way of doing business because you can demonstrate a stream of revenue. And that's terribly important when you're trying to grow the business because you can then show to investors, I've got this customer base and there's very little attrition in the customer base and they're all on subscriptions and maybe even 3-5 year subscriptions. What we've got to watch is that, and again, this affects sales to consumers, so it's the parents' side that we're thinking about. I don't know if anyone else listening to this has been caught out. Last week, I was horrified to find an invoice coming into my inbox for a charge for £1,000 for something, where I had been told about a very significant increase in the subscription costs back in October. But hey, this was actually in June. And they issued the invoice on the day that the subscription was due to renew. Fortunately, my credit card company stopped the charge, but that was a pretty horrific experience. And that shows that even as a lawyer, I can get caught out by this. And that's exactly the
£1,000. Gosh, that must be a big subscription.
Yeah, let's call it out. It's Hootsuite. It's the social media management tool, which I love
Wow, yeah.
using. So I'm no longer using it. But that shows you the pitfalls and the traps that, in fact, subscription traps is what it's often called. If you sell products on a subscription basis, it's going to be much more formalistic in terms of pre-contract information that you've got to provide before the person subscribes, and then a process of reminding the person over the period in the run-up to the renewal. It's got to be done within so many days before the renewal, so you can't issue your new invoice and claim the charge against the credit card on the day of payment without following this process beforehand. Again, that's not in effect yet. We'll be reporting in CEB as and when it does come into effect. But these are the sort of things that businesses are going to need to be aware of. I think Stripe and other payment processors will be helpful in this, because they manage a lot of the processes around payment. I've not had a chance to chat with people within Stripe yet, which I'm going to try and do, about how they're preparing to support businesses. So hopefully you will get a lot of support around this, but you have to get things right. If I've got time to mention one more thing, Claire, it would be something that affects all businesses, and that is the fact you have to deal with AWS, you have to deal with Microsoft, Apple, and the platforms such as Facebook and so on. These are now really, really big players who dominate our existence, you could say. And the government has been very keen to give the Competition and Markets Authority much more power, if you like, to push back against their activities. In Europe, they've got a Digital Markets Act, which has now come into force. And Apple has been caught out on this for the very first time with a substantial fine, because on their Apple Store platform, they don't give you an indication that you can actually go elsewhere to buy a particular product. If you go onto Amazon, you'll look at a particular product, but then you can see, oh, there are other options available to you. And that's how good business practice works. In other words, you don't sell your thing for what it is. You sell it as better than others, but show people what these others are. There's going to be what's called strategic market status accorded to the big players in terms of certain business activities. And all I would say on that is that if you in any way feel threatened by any of the activities carried out by Apple, for example, it could be their terms of business, which don't seem to work right with your business model. You can pause for thought. You can speak to the CMA directly about it. You can take legal advice, because when a business has strategic market status, the Competition and Markets Authority can then, to a certain extent, control their behavior. They can create bespoke codes of conduct. In other words, that platform will act in a particular way. You won't do this, you will do that, and so on, which is really quite interesting in terms of how that will play out.
That is helpful to know, though, because I think especially when you're an ex-teacher, you start a business, you start online, you're from home, it can feel very daunting. I remember back in the day, 2013, I don't know any of the knowledge. It feels like everything's against me. And then something changes, and then all of a sudden it is really difficult because I'm relying on this specific service or this specific way of doing things. So I've got two more on my list that I think would be good to talk about. So customer relationships, what do we need to know about that?
Yeah. Briefly, again, you've got to think about who you're selling to. And in the latest edition of the brief, we've given some hints and tips about how to frame your terms and conditions of business. But please don't overlook the fact that when you're selling to parents, it's a consumer transaction. And we've got some legislation, the Consumers' Rights regulations, that effectively dictate the way digital products, if we're thinking digital, are offered. The good news is that we don't have the situation where once something is bought and tried out, it can't be returned. So we haven't got the Amazon, I'm going to try this, but I don't like it, send it back syndrome. A digital product, once it's sold, once it's downloaded, that sale is complete. But consumers are entitled to say that the quality of what I have bought must be good. And in an education context, I think that's important because if the parent reasonably concludes what you've sold me is just not assisting me in helping my child's education, they may have a claim against you for that. It happens very rarely. I don't think we've ever seen instructions for any of our business clients in that area. But consumer rights do require things to be of the right quality. And I don't think there's much more about that than to say that there are standard terms and conditions you have to include in your terms and conditions that come from the consumer rights legislation. And you can find out more about that, again, from the Consumer Competition Markets Authority website, or a lawyer can give you terms and conditions that are compliant in that way without too much cost, because usually they're working from precedents, because it's standard, and it's not as if they're spending a lot of their intellectual time creating what they're providing to you.
Just on that, because I know you're very lovely, really, and you're not saying, oh, you must come and use a lawyer all the time, and really, trying to help us understand it for ourselves. But one of the questions that comes up to me a lot is, can you share your terms and conditions? I've definitely had other businesses go on Classroom Secrets, copy the terms and conditions, and then you go on their website and you're like, hang on, it still says Classroom Secrets. This is a bit weird, because they forgot to take something out.
Yeah.
What would you say? So you're starting a business, you need your terms and conditions. I always tell people that they should actually get their own from a lawyer.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah. That's one area where it is really good value for money to go to a lawyer who has knowledge of intellectual property rights and the protection of intellectual property, because that situation, Claire, would probably just take one letter from a law firm to make that company think, oh my gosh, I'm in trouble. If they push back against that, then that's a pathetic way of dealing with it, quite honestly. That's obviously not a business that's got any kind of ethics. Most businesses, if they get a lawyer's letter, will take down what they've done wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is important to get right. And one of the things that we've seen come up a lot, actually, is it's not necessarily the LEA schools. It is the MATs that will come forward and are really actually tooth-combing your terms and conditions. And that story that I told you actually came from a MAT realising that that was the case in the conditions, because they have a team big enough where somebody's actually going through your terms and conditions. So don't believe that nobody's going to read it either. Like, they do need to be right for your business and correct.
Yeah, that's a really good story. Fortunately, it is another area where we see very little pushback when we've helped clients with terms and conditions. So getting them right first time is a good thing.
Yeah. So while we're on terms and conditions, the other one that always comes up, privacy notices. Oh, it's the same thing. How can I get a privacy notice for my business? Has anyone got a template? And that always worries me as well, because I think, but what's not in that template that you need to know about?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Claire. Privacy notices are all about the responsibility to be transparent. You've got a duty to be transparent when you're holding personal data. And that became front and center of stage under GDPR. And the privacy notice is a key document in transparency about how you get your data, remembering that not all of it necessarily comes from the person you're dealing with. You might be taking that data from other sources and combining it. And people need to know that's going on. And there's no other way of them knowing it's going on other than through a privacy notice. And yet we find that it's the most common example of taking someone else's privacy notice and adapting it to your own. Hopefully not doing what you said there, Claire, and leaving the company's name in it, put your own company name in it. But that is not going to work. There will be things that are different about the way you receive the data, the way you process the data, who you might pass it on to, and what kind of data that you're actually taking and processing. And so the customization of that privacy notice is absolutely key.
And I think on that one as well, it's not just about having the notice. Sometimes I think we think, oh, I've got the notice, but it isn't that. You have to do the groundwork underneath that. You can't just take somebody's privacy notice and say, here we go. If you're earlier on in your business, it forces you to be more grown up in the processes you actually carry out, because you have to know that before you do the privacy notice, if that makes sense. Part of growing your business up. If you're just maybe you're working all on emails and you don't have two-factor authentication and you're not using a ticketing system. It's all these things that then if you change that process, you would need to make sure it's reflected in the privacy notice. So in some ways, it does force you to grow your business, because it's not just about the writing part of it. It's also about having a proper system and process, isn't it?
Yes. And if you don't get that right, that can come back to haunt you later, because let's say your business is going absolutely fantastically and you're looking for investment. You might be looking for an exit from it and sell it on. And then we're into due diligence, because anyone buying a business, they now realize that what they're buying will include as an asset the database of the company. And they will ask, how did that database come about? How was it created? Where did the data come from? And let's see the privacy notices that authorized you to hold that data. So it's something that is often seen as a short-term tick in the box exercise, but no, it can come back to haunt you later if you don't get it right.
Yeah. And it's not just about the notice itself. It is about making sure that you've got the right systems and processes, because I think when you start a business, you don't necessarily start with those things in place. And I suppose really speaking to somebody like yourself forces you to think about how you're going to do it, and also know whether that way is the right way to do it. Just on that, actually, when I came to your Northern Education Business Forum, one of the things that was mentioned was about outsourcing the data protection officer role. That's Ed's role at Classroom Secrets. It's definitely not his favourite thing to do. Did you say that there's thoughts that maybe it won't be able to be outsourced anymore if you wanted to do that?
Well, we've had a change of government, of course, and that is one bit of legislation that didn't make it through at the cut. And we now have a new government which will be introducing a digital data protection bill. Quite how much they will retrieve from the previous bill and use within their bill, I think they'll retain quite a lot. But the thing about data protection officers and outsourcing of the service is that they're going to have less immediate access to what's going on in the business. They're meant to challenge and make sure that you are doing things compliantly. If it's an external service, it's not as good as having someone internally that is taking ownership, if you like, of data protection matters. And I think the shift that will come through the new legislation is with emphasis on ownership. It may still allow subcontracting out, the outsourcing out of your parts of it, but at the end of the day, someone within the business has to be accountable. And perhaps surprisingly, GDPR didn't really focus much on internal accountability.
It is interesting, because it makes complete sense that somebody external is not really going to have access, as you say, to the right kind of information. But on the other hand, it does take quite a lot of knowledge. I would say that takes up quite a bit of Ed's time. Now, thankfully, he's obviously into the IT side of things, so that helps really, because he's probably seeing it anyway. But especially if you're a small business, that's like an extra load of training or things that you have to keep updated with, which is a pain, if I'm honest.
Yes. Yeah. I think it was one of the disappointments of the GDPR regime that every public sector organization had to have a data protection officer. And that person is meant to be in a position avoiding conflict. So it can't be the finance person in case you're likely to get fined. It can't be the head of technology. And the way it's interpreted, every primary school has to have a data protection officer. And, a primary school with maybe a leadership team of 3 plus a business manager, how do they do it? It hadn't been really well thought out.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. Thank you so much. This has been brilliant. I know that it's going to be so helpful for people. And I'm looking forward to recording the next episode next quarter.
Yeah, it'll be in September.
Thank you for listening to the Education Business Podcast. To get more information to grow your business, sign up at educationbusinessclub.co.uk.